A couple of years ago, according to one report, Pope Benedict's January 1st World Peace Day message launched a surprise attack against climate change prophets of doom. Didn't know that was exactly what popes did, but apparently he didn't actually do that. He also didn't characterize concerns about climate change as being scaremongering. That word was put in his mouth in the pages of Britain's tabloid, the Daily Mail, but nonetheless it bounced all over the internet, with Fox News alerting their online readers that global warming skeptics have a friend in the Vatican. Not to be outdone, the liberal blog Wonkette, probably among other blogs, took the dialogue even further south, assuming that the quotes were true, and shared with us that the Pope sucks. And they called him a Nazi, which was actually one of the only words that they called him that I can actually use here today. So obviously we were having some problems with misquotes here, but beyond that it seemed to me that there was really something fundamentally about the message that I was reading that didn't seem very papal to me, so I decided to investigate. Well, it turns out that the Vatican has its very own website in all sorts of different languages, which is very handy if you actually want to understand the Pope's World Peace Day message, as is all thoughtful writing on complex issues. There was a little bit of something in his message for everyone. But with more cherry picking of Pope quotes going on than at a cherry pickers convention, most people seem to be walking away from reading the Pope's message with their pre-existing biases firmly intact. And by reading it, of course, I mean not reading it. So here's a representative sample of what Pope Benedict was actually trying to say. Humanity today is rightly concerned about the ecological balance of tomorrow. It is important that assessments in this regard be carried out prudently in dialogue with experts and people of wisdom, uninhibited by ideological pressure to draw hasty conclusions. The problems looming on the horizon are complex and time is short. That crazy Pope. He sounds suspiciously like a world religious leader. Not being Catholic, defending the Pope is actually new territory for me. But this little fracas is really emblematic of today's distorted conversation of democracy, where bad facts and bad tempers are wrapping their gnarly little tentacles around the decisions that we make for our future, and the results are not good. This sort of kindergarten at recess tone in our civic dialogue is really particularly damaging in a democratic republic like ours. Couple hundred years ago, our founders made a really audacious bet. They bet our future that a diverse people could self-govern. And you have to remember that back at the time, that was nearly an insane idea. They were breaking with all of recorded history before them, because you see there really are advantages to having a king. If a kingdom has a problem, a good king can summon the most brilliant scholars in the land and commission them to scribble mathematical formulas into the wee hours of the morning. He can apply his royal intellect to the results and issue an edict. And actually, things got done that way. Sometimes problems were really solved. But then you kind of had the bad kings and the heads that rolled, and things like taxation without representation. So it's pretty understandable that some people thought a new idea was in order. So in this new country of ours, the king was no longer the seat of power. It was now the humble village square, a government by the people and for the people. And really this crazy notion of people being able to rule themselves came out of the Age of Enlightenment and the invention of the printing press, when all of a sudden ideas and information were traveling in ways that they never had before. So many people now knew things. Born of this was the American marketplace of ideas, where everybody had an idea, and the best ideas rose to the top. And really from that is still the American machine of innovation, which really is unparalleled even to this day. Only problem with that is the way that it worked before, you only had one brain thinking of what you were going to do. And usually the king could compromise with himself, although I suppose it depends on the king. But when you've got a million different people out there with ideas, How do you come to a conclusion? How do you decide what you're going to do? Our founders really did more than just decide that they think that we could muddle through our differences. They believed that our differences were going to be a strength for this country, and they essentially built our form of government around that assumption. Alexander Hamilton called it the jarring of parties, believed that diversity of opinion promotes deliberation and circumspection and serves to check excesses in the majority. James Madison called it factionalism and thought of it as the ultimate check on power, even stronger than the Bill of Rights, and he called the Bill of Rights a mere parchment barrier. So to emphasize, our founders built this country around the notion that we would protect it, that we would protect our freedoms by disagreeing. They built the country around the notion that we would protect it by disagreeing. Well, really right from the beginning, this was really hard to do. And there was the Thomas Jefferson and John Adams almost lifelong feud. There was that one little unfortunate incident where a sitting vice president shot and killed a former Secretary of the Treasury. So it turns out that democracy is really a pretty sloppy business. Nonetheless, if you fast forward a couple of hundred years, the American marketplace of ideas is alive and well, and in the most common places, which is really the beauty of it. There are American conversations of democracy in our civic clubs all across America, in our social clubs. There were conversations of democracies in our bowling leagues. We talked about our country and what was happening in it, and we're talking to a wide variety of people who aren't selected by anything except they just happen to like to bowl. We had 3 news channels, and we turned one of them on, and they had editors, and they more or less sort of told us the same thing. So we were talking about what was on the evening news, the water cooler conversations. Like 80% of us subscribe to our hometown newspaper, and much to journalists' chagrin, they're nowhere near that now. So the conversation in our hometowns was about what was in the paper and what happened. And then finally, if we were a Presbyterian, we'd truck on up the hill to the Presbyterian church closest to us. And there we would have friends and neighbors who were Presbyterians. That began to change in about 1965. When, for one thing, that we had so much immigration that this was a lot more diversity than we were used to. We had also become so prosperous that it meant that we could live wherever we wanted to, and we moved all around, not necessarily right up the street from our parents. Our lives were no longer about survival, sort of lower down on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're just worrying about surviving. Now we could be about belonging, and that's what we were looking to do. So we sought out people just like us. And groups, clubs, even neighborhoods became more like-minded. With more and more media choices available to us, human nature being what it was, we turned on the people who we liked to listen to and who agreed with us more than not. And then finally, we had the rise of the ideologically individualized churches and the splitting of mainline denominations into more ideological camps. This phenomena was described in wonderful detail. I highly recommend this book, The Big Sort, Why the Clustering of Like-Minded America is Tearing Us Apart. We were lucky enough to have the author, Pulitzer Prize finalist Bill Bishop, right here at FSU a couple of months ago. But basically the bottom line is that we have spent these years forming teams. And if you're forming teams, you have to worry about invoking the psychology of the tribe. If you're in a tribe, you really don't think with your head so much. You think with your heart. And literally, studies show that when highly partisan people are discussing or even just looking at something related to politics, they wire them up, and they never use the higher level of brain functioning with reasoning. It's all very lower level lizard brain kind of stuff. So Bishop says that we're living in the divided states of America, the United States of those people, in a giant feedback loop, hearing our own thoughts about what's right and wrong bounced back to us by the television shows we watch, the newspapers and books we read, the blogs we visit online, and the sermons we hear, and the neighborhoods we live in. Well, the problem is that 100 years of social psychology experiments predict what will happen when we're inside of a like-minded group like that. And that is, we will grow more extreme in the direction of the majority group of you in the group. And even to the point of denying factual reality when facts conflict with what our pre-existing notion is. If I took this group with such an arbitrary designation as saying that half of you on the right-hand side of the room were one group and on the left were another, and if I put you under experimental conditions, I could foment a growing tribalism between you. And that's completely arbitrary. There's really no differences between you. It's just human nature. So it makes it really easy to understand how when you take people who think more liberally or think more conservatively and you put them under the same circumstances, that it's really a cinch to create tribalism. And in fact, you have to really sort of move against human nature to not do it. Add to that the professional polarizers we have who basically make bazillion-dollar salaries, keeping us angry with each other every single day. And really what the wonder is that this hasn't come to arms yet. So to emphasize, mixed company moderates, like-minded company polarizes. Extremism is on the rise, and technology is fueling it. This is our very scientific diagram of the internet. And you can see we're right here, civil discourse magnified over 1 billion times, except it's probably more like 10 or 20 billion times. Al-Qaeda is an example of the combustion that can occur when modern technology meets tribalism. They're a creature of the internet. And in fact, actually, contrary to popular wisdom, terrorism, research shows that terrorism is actually created more from falling into like-minded groups than it is from poverty and lack of opportunity. Fueling all this is something I like to call the war on context, where any sort of semi-reasonable position is turned into something not even close to resembling the original by cut and paste partisan hackery, and way too many of us are ready to believe the fictitious version of the quote or the position. We basically warp what were once perfectly useful ideas when understood in moderation into black and white caricatures of ideas that are essentially so oversimplified that they're useless in solving real problems. In this black and white either-or environment, we seem to have forgotten the power of the word and. Two things can be simultaneously true to varying degrees, and if you really want to understand a problem, you're going to have to break out the word and every once in a while. Listen for it. You won't hear it very often. You'll hear an analysis and they'll do one, and then you'll turn the channel to another station and they'll be doing the other side of the analysis, but nobody says and. There's also that evil they, and listen to pundits, you'll hear a lot of that. We spend a lot of our time talking about them. So really our civic conversation is sort of boiled down to us versus them, good versus evil, which is really dangerous territory. Take no prisoners, die on that mountain. That's what it is. That's our conversation. From C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, I'm going to have to step out here to read it. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper, then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite so bad as we made it out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment? Or even determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies are as bad as possible? If it is the second, one is beginning to wish that black was a little blacker. If we give that wish its head, later on we shall wish to see gray as black and even white itself as black. And make no mistake, we are absolutely in a place where large numbers of us are content denying factual reality in service of our anger and in service of making black blacker. All this is creating a growing eliminationism in our culture, which is a belief that one's political opponents are a cancer on the body politic that must be excised in order to protect the nation. Think for a minute about what logical consequences actions could flow if this is your premise. And this is important. Eliminationism is essentially the opposite of what is required by our form of government that was left to us by our founders. They asked us to protect this country and our freedoms by disagreeing with each other, not to get rid of everybody who disagreed with us. It is fundamentally opposite. Chairman of National Endowment for the Humanities, Jim Leach, came to visit us about a year ago, and this was my favorite quote. Reality can only be perceived through multiple sets of eyes. And this is my little imaginary universe of all things knowable. And if you're trying to solve a problem, do you come over here and pick two of them and recycle it over and over again? No, you're trying to understand as much as you possibly can about the problem. If we're trying to solve a problem well, then I need to know what you know, and you need to know what I know, but we are not talking. John Stuart Mill, this is my favorite quote ever, 1859, the besetting danger is not so much of embracing falsehood for truth as of mistaking part of the truth for the whole. It might be plausibly maintained that in almost every one of the leading controversies, both sides were right in what they affirmed, though wrong in what they denied. So what they were arguing may have been correct, but what they were forgetting to think about maybe wasn't. And that if either could be made to take the other's views in addition to its own, little more would be needed to make its doctrine correct. At the close of the Constitutional Convention, someone asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government they had formed, and he said, a republic if you can keep it. Our national leaders right now are not keeping faith with this charge. They are locked inside feuding tribes, and they're paralyzed, and they're not solving the problems that are ahead of us. If we are to live up to the notion that our founders had for us, of that first bold, brave ripple, of the power of huddled masses yearning to breathe free, then I'm sorry to say, I think it's going to have to be people like us in hometowns like this one who do the hard work of getting back to mixing it up again in the village square. And if we do that, then the next time a politician holds his or her finger in the air, which they are prone to do, then maybe they'll notice that the wind has shifted a little bit. At this crossroads in our history, a kind and intelligent ruler might not do such a bad job of deciding our future for us, but there is no king. There's going to be no writ from on high. We believers in democracy know that it's better that way, as long as we citizens of democracy do our job. Thank you.